toss the baton over to you.
Great. Let me get this going here. We'll hit it. Can everyone see that okay?
Looks great.
Great. Before I start, I kind of designed this PowerPoint to one thing to if you want to move like your little box over to the top right hand portion of the screen, that's kind of where I kind of designed for people to move their Zoom box if they wanted to move it, or you could just minimize it. So thank you so much for that introduction, Dolores. Like you said, my name is Grant McKown. I'm a research staff here at the Jackson Lab at UNH under David Burdick and Ray Grizzle. And today, what I'm going to be talking about really came from a in-depth literature review I and David Burdick conducted thanks to the support of the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, which I know some of them are on the call. So big thanks to Corey Riley and Lynn Vaccaro and Rachel Stevens and Chris Peter for their funding and their support and their feedback. So today I'm hoping to address 4 big topics that we observed. What? Oh, yeah, go for it. Apologies for that. So today I'm going to be talking about 4 big topics we highlighted in our literature review that seemed like the science was somewhat established, or at least we were developing a basic knowledge of what was happening in relation to salt marsh migration. So it seemed like there were 4 big things we kind of noticed. One was environmental drivers of vegetation. So how are the soil and hydrology conditions changing in the upland that will allow for salt marsh migration? The response of that vegetation community in the upland to those changing environmental conditions, and maybe how different things, different obstacles might be presented that might delay marsh migration. And since I'm in New England, I'm going to be focusing on historic agricultural ditches and embankments, but there's also a few other things that maybe people will want to consider. At the end of the day, I really hope to teach y'all a lot about some of these upcoming topics, but hopefully leave y'all with either things to consider for your own projects or questions to keep asking in your own research as well. So just to get us all in the same reference, today mostly we're going to be focusing on what we call the high marsh and that upland border. We're really going to be leaving the low marsh, which is at least in New England and on the East Coast is dominated by spartina alternate flora. What we're really going to be focusing on is the high marsh, which is typically flooded only during spring tide, so 2 to 4 times a month. And then we're also going to be focusing on that upland border, which is usually flooded during coastal storms and flooding during king tides as well. So when we think about environmental drivers, or what is actually driving salt marsh migration, it usually can be boiled down to 3 factors, which are increased flooding, a decrease in the groundwater table depth, as well as a few chemical properties such as salinity and sulfide concentrations. And this is all derived from increased sea level rise over time. Lots of studies have shown through remote sensing and historical soil coring that salt marshes really maintain their aerial extent through long-term, gradual sea level rise that allows them enough time to migrate into the uplands. And so they kind of take these 3, when you're thinking about what might be driving salt marsh migration, it's always good to kind of compartmentalize and think of these 3 components. With increased flooding, we usually get the transport of salinity and sulfur into the shallow root zone of the upland, as well as we might get waterlogging in that root zone, which might create anaerobic conditions that a lot of plants might be intolerant of. We might get increased salinity and sulfide concentrations in the upland, which might decline seedling germination of trees, and forbs, and shrubs that are intolerant, as well as we might induce high stress on sapling and mature trees. And the third one, which I don't think a lot of people think about, which I did not think about until I did this literature review, was thinking about the decrease in the groundwater table depth, which usually causes which is, we don't see it, we don't recognize it. It might be hard to notice in the field, but really this is causing greater waterlogging in this deeper root zone And which I'll show in a little bit, it actually might be the mechanism that transport this deep saline water into that shallow root zone of trees and forests. But to kind of square us, to kind of frame our minds even more just a bit, I kind of want to think about these three stressors in two very different ways. We can think of these stressors being delivered in a pulse, so in a very big episodic disturbance. For us in New England, that might be a south or nor'easter. So if you're in Maine or New Hampshire or Massachusetts, our February and January storms this year would have been a great example. If you're more in the South or the Mid-Atlantic, you can think of hurricanes, large storms, but also just you can think of pulse stressor also as like a very large king tide as well. What happens with the pulse stressor is it essentially removes stress intolerant species of upland through this increased temporary flooding and exchange of salt. Additionally, it facilitates the colonization of our marsh species. So it provides a mechanism of transport through rack or ice rafting to transport seed or roots. Additionally, we can also think of a lot of these stressors as press or gradual stressors. You could think of this as just generally sea level rise over time, where there's just a general increase in flooding and salinity and waterlogging over a 5, 10, 20-year time scale. And over time, that removes stress tolerant species in the uplands, maybe mature trees or even phragmites. It also provides the conditions that support our marsh species. And I kind of want to think about what some of these pulse and press stressors look like, especially in the upland. And there's been some great studies over the past few years that have done some really great in-depth field monitoring of hydrology and salinity. So first, I want to talk about the figure on the left. This was by Nordio et al. 2022, where they set up groundwater level recorders and conductivity measurements in pretty deep in the root zone of an upland forest in Virginia. And they looked at it for the course of an entire year to see what might be driving long-term changes in salinity. And what they found was during a really large coastal event, which you can kind of see with that peak in the green box, that there was a huge flooding event, but within a couple of days, the water levels in the groundwater had fully drained out. However, there was a significant lag in salinity in the soil. So salinity actually took 2 to 4 weeks to recover after that big coastal flooding event. Additionally, there was a really cool geographic meta-analysis with Tropical Storm Melissa in 2019, where Kearney et al. 2019 looked at different groundwater levels throughout the East Coast and looked at conductivity as well. The interesting thing was that Tropical Storm Melissa never actually made landfall, so this was almost like a simulated king tide event. And all the ways, and you can see was the recovery time shown in that blue bar for the groundwater table decreased pretty quickly within 2 to 3 days, like in the other study. And similarly, they found that the salt in the soils actually did not recover to pre-flooding events for at least 30 and for a few sites up to 60 days or 50 days after the event. So this is what happens maybe with these big pulse stressors. They might recover quickly, but maybe some biogeochemical conditions might reside in the soils for a while. And if you're a tree sapling or a forb, this could be really detrimental in the uplands. Additionally, I kind of want to talk about maybe what a press stressor might look like, thinking in the view of groundwater. There was a great study by some UNH colleagues a few years ago that looked at what would happen in a 2-meter sea level rise event on the groundwater table and here in the Seacoast of New Hampshire. And what they found was a general 1-meter increase in the groundwater table within a kilometer or two of the coastline. And you can see in the darker bands where there was a greater increase in the groundwater table. Additionally, Fragarazzi et al. 2019 did a really great study where they set up lots of groundwater and conductivity wells along a transect in several forests in Virginia, Maryland. And their question was what drove the transport of saline water into the shallow root zone, which might impact trees. And what they found was it really wasn't these coastal pulse events, so these flooding events, maybe king tides or coastal storms. It was really the transport of saline water. And what they found was it really wasn't these coastal pulse events, so these flooding events, maybe king tides or coastal storms. It was really the transport of saline water what they found was on a seasonal scale, they would get greater precipitation, which would then drive greater evapotranspiration through increased photosynthesis from trees and shrubs and forbs. Additionally, increased precipitation might create a stronger down gradient uh, uh, for the hydrology, and so freshwater might actually get flushed out of the system more, and that would create an upwelling or an hydraulic gradient of salt water into that shallow root zone. Additionally, what's been interesting is people have been interested in thinking about what maintains this marsh boundary. In New England, we might think of this as Iva or Phragmites. It's down south, you might think of Baccharis might being on that edge, or Juncus, or maybe some other salt-tolerant species. And weirdly, there were 3 studies who studied very different things, but they actually came to very similar conclusions in terms of what maintained this marsh boundary. And what they found was, first, typically the salinity in the soil or pore water was between 5 to 10 parts per PSU. Again, this could fluctuate, but usually on average it was between 5 to 10. Additionally, on an annual basis, that area was underwater about 3 to 5% of the year. It doesn't have to happen every year. One of the studies found that on 3 separate years, it was never flooded. But on other years, it was flooded even more. So on average, about 3 to 5% per year. And so I found that really interesting. I think that might be a really great threshold or great measurement to kind of go by if we're thinking about is marsh migration possible, thinking about a project. Lastly, I really wanted to put I wanted to frame this whole conversation into the context of the 18.6-year metonic cycle. So this is the Portland tidal gauge. On the top are orange dots, is the mean sea level in North Atlantic vertical datum meters. So you can see over time here in Portland, Maine, they've seen about an increase of 20 centimeters since 1920. On the bottom in the blue is the tidal amplitude, or is the monthly mean tidal amplitude, which is just mean high water minus mean low water. And the really cool thing is you can actually see this 18.6-year metonic cycle do its thing all throughout since 1920. What's interesting here in Portland, Maine, between the peak and the trough of that cycle is between 25 centimeters difference in tidal range. We are currently about near that trough for the East Coast. And I would just like to I'm going to show this image a lot, but what I just kind of wanted to keep in mind is when we're thinking about marsh migration and we're thinking about some of these press and pull stressors, they might be heavily influenced about what stage are we in this metonic cycle. If we're near the trough, our king tides and our coastal flooding might not be as large as they would be maybe 5 to 9 years ago. So with that, I think there's just a few takeaways about environmental drivers. If you're thinking about future projects, I would highly recommend thinking about in your monitoring protocols, whether it's pre or post project, thinking about monitoring hydrology or salinity or groundwater table on long timescales. By long timescales, I mean, multiple months, maybe even up to a year, just to really get an idea of not only capturing those general flooding events, but also those really big pulse flooding events of king tides or coastal storms. Definitely understand your local site context when it comes to what is the prevalence of hurricanes or windstorms or coastal flooding. Those things are very different from the Southeast versus New England. And then also when you're planning a project, I think always think in the back of your mind, where does my project fall on this metonic cycle? We're about to plan a project and over the next 9 years, we're going to see decreasing tidal amplitude. That might impact the rate of marsh migration in my project. And lastly, there's some things I noticed in the research where there's a current lack of just experimental manipulation of these environmental drivers. These were all mostly observational studies. So anyone who wants to do some mesocosm studies or just start large-scale manipulations, I think is ripe for research. Additionally, I've been thinking about this, but no one's really done a lot of detailed monitoring on tidal dam removal sites. This would give us like a very quick picture of what migration might look like when you remove a barrier to the tides. And with that, I kind of want to take a break for a second to see if there's any questions out there. I know I kind of crammed a lot, but I'm hoping this first section kind of like put our frame of reference in mind when thinking about marsh migration.
Great, thank you so much, Grant. Any questions for Grant about this piece of his presentation? Still soaking it in, I think. Okay.
Great. Oh, I think we got one person. Yeah, Jen, do you want to ask?
Yeah, sorry, it just occurred to me. So you had mentioned a decreasing water table, and you kind of put that context in rising sea levels is the reason for a lot of those indicators that you mentioned early on. Is that
Yeah.
how is that linked, or is it not, to sea level rise? And then are you seeing that in the literature review? Was that in a lot of places or some places? If you could just say a little bit more about that piece.
Yeah, of course. So studies have kind of shown, I'll just stay here. So studies have kind of shown that sea level rise is linked to a decreasing groundwater table. And a lot of that literature actually hasn't been relative to salt marshes, but it's actually been in coastal planning or infrastructure mitigation. So there's been a few studies out of Hawaii and other coastal cities that have looked at what are the impacts of sea level rise on roads or sewer systems. What they found was it was really a increase in or a decrease in the groundwater table depth. So rising groundwater table that really actually did the most damage or actually caused the most issues when it came to sea level rise. But the problem is most people, besides a few studies out of Sergio Fogarazzi's lab, really haven't taken a big look at how that might impact salt marsh migration or the upland in of itself yet. And I think that's where it's right for more research and a better understanding.
Thank you, Grant.
Yeah, that's a great question. Are there any more? Great, I'll keep moving. So the next piece of this puzzle when thinking about marsh migration really came down to uh, it really came down to is so once we have our environmental maybe conditions correct, it's saline enough, maybe there's some flooding. I kind of noticed in the literature, including from Mary Schultz's former lab, there was actually the upland vegetation community had a really big impact on not only the viability of marsh migration, but also the rate of marsh migration. So to better understand how a salt marsh might move forward landward, it's really good to understand maybe how that upland vegetation community is actually retreating. And I just would like to say, like, there have been some studies that looked at what happens when you have those right environmental conditions for marsh migration, especially groundwater table or flooding or salinity. And there's been a few great studies out of Gideon's lab. And what they found was when they've done some transects into forest down in Virginia, they were finding marsh graminoids trying to sprout up to 15 meters in that forest. They did some great seed bank studies where they took soil cores along a transect into the woods and then they tried to germinate them. What they found was they actually saw a significant decrease in the seed bank of upland species, and they found it was mostly comprised or decently comprised of all these marsh graminoids, despite the fact that there weren't any actual marsh graminoids in under the forest yet. So there was an active transportation of root material and especially seeds into the uplands. So this marsh is trying to migrate a lot of times. But what they found is when they tried to germinate these seeds under different light conditions, what they found shown in these graphs here was that either the reproductive success or even just the germination was really controlled by the light. So understanding what that upland habitat might be doing or might be impacting it is super important in the context of future marsh migration projects. And so with that, I started thinking about, if we're on the East Coast, generally, what are the four major upland habitats that a marsh might try to migrate into? The big one, which most of the research is focused on, are coastal forests. These can be pine, maybe red maple, juniper, it could be really different in the geographic context. It could also be phragmite patches. Additionally, it could be meadows or agricultural fields, which are more prevalent down the southeast and the mid-Atlantic, as well as if you want to think longitudinally up a creek. You also have upstream tidal wetlands that might be composed of more cattails or freshwater wetland plants. But eventually that salinity gradient might reach them and it might switch to a salt marsh as well. So I want to start off and talk about the coastal forests and phragmites because that's where most of the research is kind of focused on, which has really been in the mid-Atlantic and the southeast. And really, the way I like to group these with phragmites and forests is really, you can easily define where the marsh ends and where phragmites or forest starts. It's a very definable border. Second, the upland vegetation community acts as a barrier to marsh migration, mostly just through shading out these really light dependent graminoids. And through the literature, what's happened is it really seems that pole stressors, so these big king tides or these hurricanes, or in some cases pests or even fires, actually control the rate of migration into the upland because you actually have to remove that barrier or that shading. And I really like to think about these two things, not so much marsh migration, but really upland vegetation retreat. And so I kind of want to show this conceptual model that Dave Burdick and I have really been thinking about when it comes to these different habitats. And I'm going to keep referencing it, so this won't be the only time they'll see it. I think I showed it like 5 or 6 times in this presentation. So for example, if we drew a straight line on that border where the marsh and the forest is shown on the left here, and then we wanted to see maybe what was the rate it took for that marsh to migrate that far into the forest over time. Generally, our studies before 2015 really looked like this because they were either long-term remote sensing studies, over the course of 50, 70, 80 years, or they were using, soil cores and looking at decadal or even century scales. So we had a more linear thinking. We thought marsh migration might be following more of a linear pattern. In reality, in the past 10 years, we've done a lot of great studies actually using high resolution, either remote sensing or just general field monitoring. What we found is actually, when it comes to a forest, what happens is there's actually forest resistance to marsh encroachment. So those environmental conditions might be right underneath a bunch of under a tree canopy. You might get enough flooding from time to time. You might get enough salinity. There might be waterlogging. But for some reason, those mature trees still stick around. What happens is it seems like there's some kind of patch-wide disturbance, say a hurricane, a windstorm, a fire, maybe a really large flood event that really knocks over these really stressed trees. It opens up a sizable area and you usually get maybe rapid marsh migration into that space. And so Sergio Fogarazzi's lab has really been looking at this in depth over the past 5 to 7 years. And they've been a treasure trove of information in field monitoring. And what they found was that you could divide up the coastal forest into 2 sections. And the first section would be the forest immediately adjacent to the marsh, shown in this picture, where they call it the persistent zone. And the persistent zone is where there's a mature stand of trees, but they're highly stressed. And if you were to walk through underneath those trees, you would find that there was a severe lack of saplings and seedlings, and you might not find any traditional upland shrubs or forbs or grasses underneath there. And what's going on is these trees are experiencing these environmental conditions for marsh migration, or these press stressors, like I talked about. Might be getting flooded from time to time. They might be sailing. And over time, these trees become weakened, but they have different mechanisms to at least ameliorate that. What happens is during a hurricane, during a large flood event, these trees eventually get knocked down. They're too stressed to hold up and they get knocked down. The area opens up. Behind that persistent zone is what they described as the regeneration zone. And this is what we think of a nice upland forest. If something happened to those trees, the environmental conditions would still be dry enough, it wouldn't be saline enough, and saplings and seedlings would be able to germinate and regenerate that forest without a problem. Now, I'd just like to highlight maybe in this persistent zone, if you were thinking about a project, thinking about how often it gets inundated and what the soil or the pore water salinity might be really indicative of this persistent zone. Additionally, Walters et al. In 2021 down in the Blackwater National Wildlife Reserve, I believe, conducted a facilitation experimental design where what they did was on the left hand of that box, they did two large-scale experimental conditions where they full cut a stand of trees adjacent to a marsh, or they girdled them, where essentially they took saws and they partially cut them to simulate either pest or damage or maybe a very large windstorm, essentially to stress out the trees. And then they monitored every year to see if they could facilitate marsh migration into that area. What they found was early on, a lot of marsh graminoids, especially on that border region, actually moved in. They said, great. I'm sure they high-fived. But what they found was after 5 years, that forest was already starting to regenerate and was actually shooting out a lot of the marsh graminoids, and the forest was coming back. Luckily, they took groundwater samples, and what they found was that there was less than 2% of flooding in these areas, and that the salinity on average remained less than 2 parts per thousand, or PSU. So they probably kind of crossed that essential threshold that I kind of talked about earlier. Additionally, I kind of want to highlight the botanic cycle again, and that study took place in 2015, right at the peak, shown kind of in the bottom right-hand corner that yellow circle is. And then over the course of that study, that tidal amplitude actually decreased over time. So they might have seen even less flooding over time in that area as that tidal amplitude decreased. But I'm not sure how large that tidal amplitude change would be down that area. So the next one is Phragmites. And if we were to look at that same conceptual model where the green lines are linear, or is our previous thinking of how marsh migrates into a forest, and then that orange line is where what we know as how forests migrate landward. What we see is Phragmites will actually possibly, if Phragmites is really prevalent in your area, might actually move in and occupy a portion of that migration space after that forest is retreated. Essentially, it kind of sneaks in, and before the marsh graminoids can really move in, it kind of kicks them out and acts like a secondary wall to it. And what was interesting was Smith et al. In 2013 actually did a large-scale remote sensing project on the New Jersey coastline and wanted to see between 1930 and 2011 how much the marsh had migrated back. And what he found was, what he couldn't figure out was, even though the forest had migrated so much, the marsh had only migrated back 33% of that space. And he couldn't figure out, and he finally went back into his model and reanalyzed it and found that actually it was Phragmites had taken over 66% of that forest retreat in New Jersey. And if you know anything about Phragmites, you know, it is very stress tolerant. It can occupy a large gradient of salinity and waterlogging and sulfide conditions. Typically, we see a lot of Phragmites in the Northeast on those edges of forests, on the upland edges of salt marshes. Additionally, there's been a couple studies looking at the shade tolerance of Phragmites. And I know Shaw et al. 2021 did a great job looking at it. And what they found was the prevalence of Phragmites, which is the y-axis on this graph, and tree canopy cover, which is the x-axis, they found that there was still like a fair amount of Phragmites, even at 50% shade cover, and there was even some even at 75% shade cover. Which kind of shows you that I kind of like to say like Phragmites is kind of lurking in the woods, just waiting for its opportunity to like pounce when the trees finally die back. So that's something also to consider in future projects. Do you have Phragmites prevalent in the near landscape that might be able to move in after you've done all this hard work to facilitate marsh migration? So next, I kind of want to change quickly to upstream tidal wetlands and meadows and agriculture. There hasn't been a lot of research on these two. There's only been a handful of studies, but it seems like they both follow similar patterns, which are very different from the forest and the Phragmites. Essentially, when you have marsh migration into these two systems, it can be possibly difficult to locate where that true upland border might be with the salt marsh. What really controls the rate of migration is these gradual, I should say gradual press stressors. So things like sea level rise, general flooding, and general salinity. And I would say marsh migration is probably the best descriptor for this. This is actually the marsh moving into an area and eventually kicking out the upland habitat community. And so what it looks like is there's just a messy transition. What happens is over time, you might have some pulse events, maybe a big king tide event or coastal storm, and that flooding and that salinity might kick out stress intolerant species, maybe some upland species, or maybe some in a wetland scenario, a very freshwater species. That pulse events might also transport seeds and root material from the salt marsh into the wetland or the field and allow it to get a foothold. There's been some ecosystem studies of freshwater wetlands or tidal freshwater wetlands. They show that Spartina alterniflora is able to get a foothold and at least hang on and at least have an existence in these wetlands with a continual rate of 2 to 3 part salinity or PSU of salinity. And then over time, as the groundwater table decreases, as flooding increases, as salinity and sulfide concentrations increase, the salt marsh graminoids outcompete the upland habitat. And I just kind of like to show this little graphic here of Eden and Fernandez Pascal in 2018. They did a really in-depth botanical study of agricultural fields in Virginia adjacent to salt marshes, especially those that were being salinized. And what they did was they just took random plots all throughout and characterized the species composition. And so in the ordination on the left, the way to understand this graph is that each line where it says saline field or old field is a plot. And then each of the colored polygons are all those plots together and their ordination space of their species composition. And what they found was it was a really messy space. What they found was that a lot of these saline fields really overlapped with both a salt marsh and also with a dry field as well that wasn't experiencing any flooding or saline. So you might see this maybe in some other projects too. It might be messy. It might not look like a nice border is moving up into the field or into the wetlands. So I kind of have a couple points I want to stress is if you're doing marsh migration projects, if you're doing land conservation, maybe if your goal is marsh migration, you could expedite it through the removal of an upland forest or Phragmites. Definitely, if you're thinking about doing that, monitoring hydrology and salinity thresholds should probably be met to make sure those environmental conditions are ready. If not, you might just have Phragmites or trees just move right back in again. And additionally, if you have a project with a meadow or tidal wetlands, just be sure that you're removing any barriers or any steep slopes that might prevent flooding or marsh migration. And it seems like as long as you remove those barriers, over time, sea level rise should create the correct environmental conditions for the marsh to migrate without too many issues. So maybe just kick back and watch. Additionally, I've been thinking about what might control the retreat of force into the Northeast. I know we have some nor'easters and some sou'easters in the wintertime, but we don't have these hurricanes and these fires like we do down south. And additionally, there really is not much research on these tidal wetlands and on these meadows. So if anyone's thinking about that, I think it's also ripe for research in those projects. With that, are there any questions? I know that section is kind of jam-packed with a lot of different ideas.
I don't see any questions in the chat. I'm kind of curious if anybody is familiar with any of the case studies that you've presented. I see on the participant list, there are folks from the Chesapeake Bay region who maybe were familiar with the Blackwater project or any of the other projects that you referenced.
Yeah, I would honestly be too. And I would like to kind of reiterate in terms of like geographic distribution of where a lot of these projects or the research is, it has mostly been in the mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. Really like Georgia through the Chesapeake Bay. There's really been a serious lack of projects in the Northeast and New England as well. I feel like the Mid-Atlantic's been doing this for at least 10 to 15 years, and New England has been just thinking about this for the past 2 to 3 now. So I would like to add that caveat on top of all of this. Some of this might not apply to New England or maybe the West Coast.
That's great. I think that's a key kind of ethic of the reserve system, is to learn from other regions, and it's nice to know that the Mid-Atlantic is the one to watch here.
Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions, so
Great. The third thing I really want to talk about is thinking about what might delay marsh migration outside of just the vegetation. And I'm going to kind of dive into like a very New England example, because that's just what I know and what I love in my heart. But I know there's a lot more other examples that others might be wrestling with. And so I'd actually love to hear about them at the end of this section, or at the end of the talk too. But for now, I'm going to really focus on historical agricultural ditching and embankments, which may delay migration, which are really prevalent in New England and Northeast marshes. So I'm going to just jump in, and I'm just going to make a very declaratory statement and just say, at least in the Northeast, from New Jersey to Nova Scotia, it is most likely that a large salt marsh meadow was probably farmed at some point, from a colonist all the way up to pre the Depression, the 1930s, especially here in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, and Maine. Every time our lab, on top of different reserves and New England wetland restoration, every time we look either in the history or we actually walk in the field, we see evidence of either tidal restrictions, farming saddles, which is what's on the right, all those little sticks sticking up. We also see a lot of embankments and a lot of ditching. And this is also on top of all the other impacts that humans have made to salt marshes, including open water marsh management, including the civilian corps, mosquito ditching as well. But a lot of these impacts from agriculture have been really long lasting, especially in the Northeast, and have really having impacts on our salt marsh, and might actually be impacting the future of salt marshes in terms of their ability to migrate. And so these are still being impacted today. On the left is just an aerial view of the Hampton Seabrook estuary. You can see that there are a lot of ditching and a lot of cross ditching, which is really evident of agriculture. Additionally, on the right is an embankment that goes through a pool, which I'll actually show you an aerial of in a bit, that goes through Fair Hill Marsh here in New Hampshire. Additionally, you can see that these embankments aren't just little tufts of grass on the water. These are actually structures that are still in place that people can just still walk on without any issues at all. And so what happens is what these features do is they create what we like to call waffle pool landscapes, where there's embankments on either side of all these ditches. It allows flooding in, but usually water remains on the landscape. And over time, that marsh subsides, and we get these large pool complexes. Smith et al. In 2019 did an aerial overview at different marshes of interest, and so they looked at, can they find these waffle pool landscape features, and they quantified it. As you can see, they found waffle pool complexes from New Hampshire and northern Massachusetts, all the way down to Maryland and Virginia, based off the purple and orange highlighting. Additionally, we partner up in New Hampshire with our restoration activities. We partner with New England Wetland Restoration with Jeff Wilson, and he has become a jack of all trades when it comes to actually walking sites and using aerometry to actually map these embankments. It seems like the more time we spend at a site, the more embankments we find, which are shown on the red out there. And these embankments are over the course of 200 to 300 years, because these marshes were heavily farmed for the past 200 to 300 years. But I just kind of want to show, like, this is the magnitude, especially in the Northeast, that we might be dealing with this issue. So I kind of want to highlight a site in Fair Hill Marsh and show you maybe how some of these impairments might be impacting marsh migration. There's a big restoration going on at this marsh. It recently got awarded money from America the Beautiful, and so a lot of salt marsh partners, including Great Bay NERR, is partnering with this. And so one of the things we are trying to wrap our minds around with is how to incorporate marsh migration and tackle some of these impairments. So on the south side of Fair Hills, where the target of the restoration is. And what I just like to point out is that there's a straight line between this red maple forest and this salt marsh. And a lot of times that might indicate that there's an embankment that might be preventing flooding there. And I just kind of want to go a little bit more in depth about what these embankments and these ditches might do. Just kind of show a few more photos. So at Kids Island in northern Mass, you might get the subsidence. So here's an on-ground view of the waffle pool complex. Additionally, you might see perimeter embankments behind or in front of either red maple or Atlantic white cedar swamps. So these are areas where it's waterlogged, possibly from sea level rise, but due to embankments, and I'll show later perimeter ditching, it's actually, those are ameliorating salinity and coastal flooding events in that area. So when we walked this site at Fairhill Marsh, we realized that on top of that perimeter embankment that was in front of that red maple swamp, we realized there was a perimeter ditch that went all the way around that red maple swamp complex too. And these ditches are large. For context, that ditch is probably at least 10 feet wide, and it was at least waist to chest deep. I did not test it out, but it looked quite deep. And what's happening is groundwater, or if during a really large coastal flooding event, these ditches provide excellent drainage to remove both salinity and surface water out of that site, allowing these this red maple swamp to continually exist without turning into salt marsh. We hypothesize, again, we haven't done any official studies, but we hypothesize that a lot of these red maple swamps immediately behind salt marshes most likely used to be a salt marsh or at least a brackish cattail marsh. But now due to these impairments and this infrastructure that's still in place, it actually is able to maintain a forested swamp habitat. And again, you can see that perimeter ditch in front of it as well as where the line of cattails are. You can't see the ditch itself, but where that line of cattails is about a nice little drop off of a small ditch as well. So why am I bringing up this farmers in the marsh and all these impacts? Well, what we're realizing is that these old agricultural infrastructure that's been abandoned, but still maintaining its function somewhat, is actually delaying marsh migration. So if you want to think of this red maple swamp idea, it's an upland forest. So if we go back to our conceptual model, here's what we think of forest might act like in a stepwise fashion. If we add our impairments, what might happen is we might actually just delay marsh migration. That forest might be able to resist encroachment for even longer than what might happen. Eventually, I would hope eventually that forest would retreat landward based off a big pulse event. It could also just finally die off from increased press stressors as well. But eventually space will open up and the marsh should be able to move landward. Additionally, these impairments we're starting to realize might actually facilitate Phragmites colonization, which then would actually further delay marsh migration. If we want to go back to that study I highlighted earlier in New Jersey with Smith et al., what we realized was, especially in New Jersey and the areas he looked at in southern New Jersey, we realized that there are embankments right against these forests, and there's ditches all against these forests, or what we call perimeter embankments and perimeter ditching. And those are great places for Phragmites to hop on. They are drier, they are less salty, but they still get flooded from time to time. So upland species aren't really colonizing it. So it's a great little window for Phragmites to kind of hop on and basically create a second wall to prevent salt marsh from moving back, on top of possibly ameliorating conditions for the upland forest as well. Additionally, I was really curious, so I started kind of deep diving into old papers that looked at Phragmites expansion and really trying to document when and where did Phragmites start to colonize in the 50s and the 70s in the Northeast. And I came across this little tidbit in Phillip and Field 2004 when they looked at historical maps. And what they found was, here in the yellow, that in their specific marsh in Delaware Bay, Phragmites started to occur around 1950, and they were most often near a creek or a mouth, which we now know it has embankments on it. It was typically on creek bank berms. They were on the tidal upland edge. So where marsh migration might be happening, we know there's a lot of perimeter embankments and ditching. And they might have be on the central marsh plain, which we know embankments and ditches ran throughout the marsh platform as well. Additionally, when I look back time-wise and started thinking about that metonic cycle in addition to it, I found that the two most prevalent areas that people discussed initial Phragmites colonization were around 1950 and around 1970. And we know from the metonic cycle now that this was at the trough of it. So the tidal amplitude would have been decreased, at least in the New England, about 25 centimeters, which would have given an excellent place for Phragmites to hop onto and colonize a little bit drier and a little bit less saline area for a small time period. Additionally, there have been some work over just the past few years of thinking about stuff outside of agricultural impairments that might be major obstacles for migration. So Berman et al. 2023 really mapped out where are all the brownfields and hazardous or contaminated sites in Rhode Island, which are shown in orange here. And they really wanted to look at how many are potentially in the path of marsh migration for the next 50 to 100 years, especially in the Narragansett Bay estuary and the Long Island Sounds. What they found was there was a ton. There were a lot of contaminated areas that might be blocking or prohibitive of marsh migration to occur. Additionally, when you're thinking about your own projects, there might be water, electrical, or sewer infrastructure. Of course, there might be homeowners. If you're thinking about tidal wetlands, there might be undersized tidal culverts or dams. Additionally, some of the things we see in New England is there's a lot of walking trails in forest. So how are you going to move those back as well so the public can still enjoy that space while also allowing marsh migration to occur? So I kind of wanted to hit on a few things where you can use aerial imagery to possibly identify these red maple swamps immediately behind salt marshes. That's the best way we find them. They really do stick out like a sore thumb if you have fall aerial imagery, which a lot of times Google Earth does. Get out to your sites. A lot of times finding these ditches or these embankments or these steep artificial slopes, we did not find some at some of our sites until we actually walked the site and almost fell into some of these ditches. So definitely getting to know your site on a really deep level, I think, is really important for thinking about marsh facilitation. Additionally, if you're trying to facilitate marsh migration, you might need to remediate these historic impairments by either removing embankments or remediating ditches as well to at least restore the tidal flooding that should be happening in some of these sites too. Additionally, I would also like to know if people have also seen other impairments that prevent marsh migration. These are things I see in the Northeast, and I don't know what goes on in Georgia or South Carolina or Florida or even the West Coast. So I'm really curious what other people have seen. And I'm just curious if there were any Phragmites removal projects that were specifically aimed at marsh migration. I haven't been able to find any, and I'd be really curious to see how those went as well. With that, I'm going to leave it. If there's any questions, and then we'll hit a field trip, and then I will be done. I can take more questions too, but I was curious if there were any questions for this section.
Any questions for Grant, or curious if anyone else has seen other barriers than the ones Grant has mentioned to marsh migration? Or your second question was about whether Phragmites removal has been paired with marsh migration planning, right, Grant? So any of those two topics that people have been aware of or engaged in? Corey.
Yeah, I was wondering about what you think, Grant, about rail lines, because I know when I look at a map around here, there's a lot of railroads that go straight to the marsh. And I guess I'm wondering if that's, true in other parts of, especially like the North Atlantic.
Yeah, I would imagine a lot of these rail lines, basically function as barriers to marsh migration, especially if there's not a culvert under them. A lot of times, especially in northern Mass, some of those rail lines were just built on really large agricultural embankments to begin with. I think that's a really good question. I know even talking to some Maine colleagues, they're having to wrestle with that idea of the state wanting to maintain proper rail lines, and if they're not being used at this point, I think they call it railroad ready or rail ready, while at the same time trying to get marsh migration or just restore the tidal flow. I think that's going to be a really big issue, especially up here in the Northeast where they have crisscross salt marshes. Anyone else?
Not seeing any other questions. And of course, you know, if they're still kind of forming in your brains, we are going to have plenty of time for discussion at the end. So I think it's probably okay to go on, Grant.
Great. And lastly, I just kind of want to highlight some talks. I know definitely getting near the hour point. So I just kind of want to highlight one project just south of our lab, which is shown here in the white rectangle. Kind of want to show off Stratford Point, which is a natural marsh migration site here on Great Bay in New Hampshire. We don't have too many of those in New Hampshire right now, so it was really fun to go visit the site, do a little field work, and kind of understand it more. What we see from the Google Earth imagery is that between 2014 and up to 2020, even now, the forest, a ghost forest has formed where all the standing trees, including pine and maples, have died back. And so we were curious, what did that look like? How the marsh migrated? What possibly contributed to the ghost forest forming in the first place? And the thing we really discovered was when we got there and I took a GPS and kind of just made borders around different vegetation habitats where there was some Phragmites and it was on embankment, and I'll show it in a second. But what we found was like the high marsh platform, which we think of in New England as Spartina patens, Juncus gerardi, Disticula spicata, hadn't really moved in yet. It was actually all these narrow, what we think of as the narrow border species. So Spartina pectinata, Iberfrutans, American germander had really moved in and totally colonized these areas, which was interesting. You don't usually get to see a wide swath of it. And these are kind of a few photos of what that area looks like. There's also a lot of thin leaf cattail as well, which is known for brackish areas. Additionally, when we walked the site, we realized there was an entire embankment wrapping around the entire site where the Phragmites had colonized, and we think that's probably what might have delayed the marsh from migrating inland. Was this embankment had been preventing tidal flow the entire time. And we found actually two sections where the embankment had finally washed away or had broken through, and that might have led to a pretty quick rapid die-off of that ghost forest. Additionally, we've also found a small perimeter ditch right seaward of that as well, which was collecting water and probably providing an avenue for drainage off that embankment and the upland area as well. So just as a small recap, I just kind of want to show, you know, what a site might look like with embankments, with ditching, and kind of what a site might look like maybe in the first 10 years. You know, you might see we consider these narrow border species might actually fill in the space for a while before that true normal tidal flooding takes place for high marsh species to move in. Additionally, embankments and ditching might actually delay that marsh migration as well. And what I kind of learned out there with this site was a need for a standardized and long-term monitoring protocol for marsh migration. I had so many thoughts when I was out in the field and I didn't know where to start. And so it'd be great to set up permit transects or get thinking about what a standardized monitoring protocol might look like. I started thinking about maybe, is there a time lag between ghost forest formation and the colonization by these high marsh graminoids? You know, what is that time lag? And additionally, I was really thinking about what is the time required for true peat development into that upland as well. How do we get those true soil conditions that we're so used to in the salt marsh actually form in the upland? And I'm just going to skip to just some broader takeaways I hope you got from this talk. The first thing I just want to say is this research is still evolving. People are still publishing papers on it every year, and I think our understanding of marsh migration and all these little side topics around it, I think is still evolving, and we still have a lot to learn over the next 10 to 20 years. So I think if you have an idea of marsh migration that you really want to study, I think it is right for the taking. I'd also like to highlight what works in Virginia might not apply to New Hampshire or Oregon or Florida. You know, understanding your local site context in terms of climate, in terms of species distribution, whether it's the salt marsh or in the upland, or your tidal amplitude might be, or tidal range, it's going to be really important in understanding a lot of your site. But I do want to leave a couple things, maybe as large takeaways that when you're thinking about marsh facilitation projects, you know, understand your specific site, monitoring, in-field monitoring is really crucial on top of that remote sensing work. I know you guys have kind of done some webinars on, do a lot of site visits, and I think understand the potential obstacles to migration. Is it the upland vegetation community? Is it ditching? Is it hazardous waste? Is it infrastructure? I think those will be really important for a successful project. I think too, marsh migration is a long-term process, and that your success criteria should reflect that uncertainty. There were sites that I kind of read about where they were monitoring it, and they found that, certain years they just got no flooding into the uplands. And then on other years, they had a lot of storms and and maybe the king tides were larger, and that led to more flooding. So I think being able to understand that this is not like a couple year project, like sometimes our restoration projects are. This is on a 5, 10, 20-year time span, especially when we want to incorporate that 19-year metonic cycle into all of this as well. And lastly, I just kind of want to hit on, always check for barriers to migration. And, if you're trying to actively promote marsh migration in a quicker way, removal of barriers to migration might be key to your project. And lastly, I just want to highlight again, there's still just a lot we don't know about this. Especially when it comes to things like certain habitats, certain locations around the country, basically had no research. Certain factors I couldn't come across, such as, and what about locations where there's a lot of groundwater seepage adjacent to the salt marsh? We don't really know about soils either, especially the transition in soils. So I think there's still a lot we don't know. And I think as we do more pilot projects, I would just ask that everyone, try and publish, or at least get reports out, or at least talk to other people. I think there's a lot we still have to learn. And lastly, if there's any questions, I would love to take them, love to have a conversation with y'all. If there's anything you have learned in your site, I would love to learn about it too. And if you're curious where all this info came from or where that literature review is, it's on the University of New Hampshire's Scholars Repository. All you have to do is basically Google Marsh Migration UNH, and it should take you right there. And with that, I'll leave it up to, I guess, Dolores.
Actually, Mary's going to take over this part.
Oh, Mary. Okay.
No problem. Thank you so much, Grant. That was awesome. So much information. And we would be happy to circulate the report that Grant just mentioned to supplement this talk later on. So we have about 20 to 25 minutes for discussion. So if anyone has questions or reflections, please feel free to raise your hand or pop a question in the chat. And please, when you come off mute, if you could just introduce yourself and state your affiliation, that would be great, because we do have some faces beyond our regular Pathways to Resilience project team on the call. And Grant, I did want to note that Martha from, I think it's the Partnership for Delaware Estuary, made a comment in the chat that they're working with Ducks Unlimited and U.S. Fish and Wildlife on pilot projects in New Jersey and Delaware using low-cost, low-tech applications to alter previously altered wetlands. So that might be.
That's awesome.
You're right, Mary. And Grant, I'm fascinated by the work that you've done here. And I think some of what you've brought out here would be really helpful. We have a coastal modern tide, coastal wetland monitoring network here in New Jersey. And I really think what you're bringing forward, and obviously I'll work with Angie on that, your discussion would be really helpful in helping us. We're continuing to improve our monitoring protocols within the wetlands. We're just starting to add acoustic monitoring. And I really think some of the things that you've brought forth, we should be really considering them adding, like the protocol for marsh migration. So great presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And it's really cool to hear about y'all are doing pilot projects down there. I would love to see down the road how those turned out, or what you guys, or what those low-tech applications are.
Yeah, it's basically we're so super ditched like you are that it's trying to utilize like natural materials to recreate the original hydrology, but in some cases it is taking down some barriers, mostly like deposition type barriers that they use when they were digging out those wetlands. But I hadn't really thought about, and I need to now look at, we have a number of long-term monitoring sites in New Jersey, but now I know anecdotally in Barnegat and in Delaware Bay that ditch along the forest exists, and that's something that we need
Yeah.
to start thinking about. So, yeah, we'll be happy to share with the group, as time goes on. It's just we have some RGGI money through the state of New Jersey, and then some NIFWIF money. So we're just starting to do some of this work, but so we haven't gotten to publication yet.
Great. No, that's awesome. That's awesome to hear that y'all are trying to tackle that.
Very cool. Does anyone else have any? Betsy?
Yeah,
saw your
Grant,
hand.
I just want to echo that. Great presentation, just so meaty. Thank you so much. I wondered if you were thinking about or saw anyone thinking about, or if anyone else is thinking about the fact the sea level rise rate is also changing. And in the mid-Atlantic, I think it's doubled or tripled at this point. And so
wow.
any thoughts about how that is interacting with the metonic cycle and some of the other things that you were talking about?
Yeah, my understanding would be, it might be, I don't know if I'm going on a limb here, but I would imagine it interplays with the metonic cycle, as in I would imagine it's almost like an additive effect a little bit, because that metonic cycle is all lunar based. It has nothing to do with sea level rise or anything. So it's my understanding is it's independent of sea level rise. So I assume it is going to be additive onto sea level rise. When you have an increase in that tidal amplitude. So you might see even more flooding is what I would imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I imagine you might get even more flooding in that upland zone, or more you might get more erosion on that salt marsh shoreline, but I imagine you might get more flooding into that higher marsh border or upland zone as well with it.
Also probably why we're seeing more examples of this, in the research in the mid-Atlantic, because there's just, more accelerated
Yeah.
impacts.
Yeah, that would make sense. I know in New Hampshire, and then we're trying to get as many restoration projects completed over the next 2 to 3 years as possible before that metonic cycle starts to increase again and start to cause some issues as well. So I know we're trying to race against time to get a lot of work done and hopefully build some marsh resilience before we reach that peak.
Betsy, do you have another?
I do. I wondered if people were thinking about percent organic matter in the soils and how that, what's happening with that as the organic soils move into previously forested cover, and whether there are any lessons there for practitioners.
Yeah, that's a great question. That is the one thing I really wanted to sink my teeth in, was how soils might change with a lot of this more flooding. I was really hoping there I might come across a paper where a lot of there might have been like a tidal dam being removed, which is happening all across New England. And someone really monitored like the upland instead of maybe just like a reservoir, which is normally what's in New England. And I failed to come across it. There were a few studies that kind of looked at slow flooding into the upland. Like it was really looking at how salinity changed, but they also were kind of discovering there's some minor subsidence in that. And I don't know if that's just because a lot of trees and shrubs die, maybe their roots decompose, or if it's the stored organic matter might decompose as well, the little bit that's in an upland soil. So I would be curious too. I don't really have a good answer for that, to be honest. About all I know is from my previous wetland research is that soils take a long time to change, especially when it comes to wetland restoration. And I imagine these soils will take a much longer time to reflect our traditional PD salt marshes, even after the vegetation has moved in. That's usually what we see in salt marsh, like living shoreline restoration projects, or even freshwater wetland restoration projects. They're usually on a totally different time. The soils are on a different time scale than the vegetation.
Yeah, that's a great question. Does anyone else have anything for Grant? If not, I do have some questions for you. One, and I know we were kind of touching on this and you had this in your wrap up slide at the end, but just generally wondering if you can speak to the potential differences in the process of marsh migration between, say, New England and the Southeast overall, just like what you found in the literature.
Yeah, it's kind of like I kind of mentioned earlier, most of it was kind of centered on the Mid-Atlantic or the Southeast, and there wasn't too much in New England. And I've been thinking about this a lot without actually like finding anything. Really, just me like at my desk thinking about it once in a while. But I've been wondering, usually when it comes to like coastal forest retreat, it really just seemed like they are punctuated by these big pulse events. And well, a lot of times they cite hurricanes or these really big king floods with the wind damage. But there's also a couple studies where pests moved through and wiped out these stress trees. Or one site, actually a fire broke out and destroyed their field area or their study area, and then they watched the marsh migrate through it. I'm actually from Georgia, Tennessee, and I know hurricanes and windstorms and everything. And New England, we don't really get them except for during winter nor'easters or south, or like this year we got two really bad sou'easters. And so I'm wondering, are those pulse events just those in the wintertime versus those in the summer, or do these trees eventually just slowly die out from just the gradual increase in flooding and salinity? Maybe we don't have those big pulse events like we do down east.
Yeah, I was also wondering how tree type might differ from north to south and how that might influence too. I know there's right now in the literature, only certain trees we're kind of studying the effects of.
Yeah, and there's been a few studies that kind of looked at what's the salinity tolerance of like a juniper or I forget what the common one is along in the middle. Is it white pine? That's right there on the edge. But those are all mesocosm studies with like a 2 to 4 year old tree in a pot. It's not a fully mature tree that has developed mechanisms or can asymmetrically root out. So I think there's a lot more to study about that.
Yep. Great. Chris had a question in the chat. Did you come across research where historic marsh migration has been occurring over decades on barrier islands provides insights for current marsh migration in a non-barrier island context? I'm not sure if I read
Yeah,
that.
I think I understand it. In terms of like a back barrier or a barrier island context, there actually hasn't been too much. I actually came across off the top of my head, there was 1 or 2 papers, and it was really interesting. They were looking at some big flooding events, and they looked at what did the vegetation going to change over time in the immediate year or couple years. And they actually found there was a shift in like the understory shrub community. So that America, I think it's like Pennsylvania or Carolinas, which is kind of salt tolerant, is actually had migrated deep into the forest where the flooding had occurred, but the tree canopy was still there. And so those papers actually led me on a goose chase to understanding, are there possible vegetation indicators of marsh migration? But those were really, I feel like they were very limited case studies, and I think they had some context when it came to understanding maybe how these kind of leading indicators of vegetation, because we saw that too at our site, Shackford Point. We saw bayberry had actually moved into underneath the tree canopy, and actually we're on those embankments outside the Phragmites. So if you see bayberry, maybe that's possibly maybe your leading indicator of marsh migration potentially. But that was the only thing I saw from a barrier island context. But it would not surprise me if there were honestly more papers out there for those, because I know those are great examples of where marsh migration will definitely occur.
Yeah, thanks, Grant.
Yeah, really interesting. Any other questions? Grant, I think I was curious, going back to Martha's comment about low tech, low cost applications in this context. I was curious, given that, reserves are great places to study this happening. Are there any easy sort of in the field indicators of the early stages of marsh migration that reserves could be looking out for? And then, building on that, what might be some easy or passive things to monitor to observe marsh migration if folks, don't have the funding in place for a specific study right now?
Yeah, that's honestly a great question. And I think the big thing, if there's limited funding and if you have time, I know a lot of NERs have these permanent marsh transects, or what they call them, long-term plots. I forget what the term is. If those could be, if it's possible, those could be further extended into the upland if you think there's a place for marsh migration. Adding several plots onto those transects, if that's allowed under the protocol. Having some permanent monitoring transects, I think would be good. I know in New Hampshire, we have a working group that I'm a part of that we're trying to develop a standardized vegetation monitoring protocol that various groups like the Nature Conservancy or our lab or Great Bay NER can use. I think some easy indicators to look if you're just wandering a site and just really curious is looking for some of those borders. If some of those border species have moved in underneath the canopy. For example, I know in the Northeast, seaside goldenrod or Solidago sempervirens is one I look for a lot because it gets easily transported during floods like seeds wise and might germinate a few months later. I think looking if you might see bayberry or baccaris or iba right on the edge of an upland, or maybe if there's a gap in the tree canopy, if there's one starting to come up as well. I think also if you know your upland shrubs or forbs, or if you don't see tree saplings, maybe within the first 5 to 10 meters of your forest, that might be really prime that there's enough flooding or salinity that has either wiped them out or is preventing germination anymore. So, and also just walking through there, is there like rack? Is rack built up in the forest? I was in Sprague Marsh in Maine a couple months ago, and I just went wandering around in there at the edge of a marsh, and I found rack, 3 to 5 meters into it. I found some goldenrod starting to pop up. I did see a few tree saplings, pine saplings coming up, so maybe it's right at that threshold. But I think looking for those. And if you do have funding, maybe just putting in some groundwater wells. If you can, we use PVC pipes with hobos, and if you can stick them in and then just walk away for 3 to 5 months and then come back to them, I know that might be a little bit more low cost too if there are funds available.
Yeah, those are all great. And I did want to add, you probably are familiar with the ecotones monitoring that I think is kind of developed out of the NERS, and Chris Peters in New Hampshire, you're probably have, interacted with that protocol before, but I think that it's just not something that's happening in every reserve, and more reserves are starting to work on the ecotones monitoring. And I also think it's pretty vegetation driven. So there's always room for improvement and more to add to that. Not that we want to, create more work and more protocols, but it's always good to, see what other monitoring exists.
Yeah.
How we can improve. And Becky, I didn't mean to hold you up.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just wondering, Grant, if in your research you found any, and this wouldn't be in the scientific side, but maybe more anecdotally, like whether there was any like pushback from the community or from people about this talk about marsh migration, because it's obviously like we're promoting marsh migration, but about cutting down a forest to promote migration, like those kind of things. Like, was that anything that you came across, or like a freshwater wetland, for example, and like promote, removing barriers to promote salt marsh migration? Some people I could see who are, avid birders, for example of like a certain freshwater wetland bird would not want that, for example.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know, speaking of just the report we did, it really wasn't focused on like societal values or people's experiences from that point of view. But I know from previous other salt marsh restoration projects, such as the Wagon Hill Farm Living Shoreline, that in here in Durham, New Hampshire, we had some initial pushback on removing trees that were out shading the marsh. I know David Burdick still has a small crusade to get rid of more trees that are shading other parts of the marsh out. And the new phase 2 of Wagon Wheel Farm will definitely have trees removed. And I'm wondering how the public reacts, because there is a walking trail that will go right there where they will have to regrade or remove trees. So I'm really curious. There's another example that you made me think of is, I believe it's Stubbs Pond in the Great Bay Wildlife Refuge. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it is a tidally restricting dam, for everyone who doesn't know, on an old military base, I believe, and it's now like part of a wildlife refuge here. But it is beautiful birding habitat for like wetland species. Like it is awesome. But I know like it is a primary. If you want to instant large swaths of marsh migration, removing that dam is like it's probably like the easiest way to get some acreage out of it. But to be honest, I am conflicted because I actually like running over there and birding over there because it is truly wonderful bird habitat. So I think, for a lot of times with marsh migration, I think sometimes the trade-off topic might be more moot because it's gonna happen. But at times, there are deliberate considerations I think people should have to engage stakeholders with or the public with as well, especially if it impacts a public space that's near and dear.
Yeah, that's a great point, Becky and Grant, about trade-offs. It's definitely what a lot of reserves are grappling with.
Yeah, and Mary, didn't y'all was it at your reserve? Y'all removed a road possibly? Or am I misremembering that?
Yeah, we have in the planning phases, a project to kind of route a road further upland. Luckily it's out on the reserve. It's a pretty unused road at the moment, so it's not too controversial, but yeah, that's part of a marsh migration facilitation project. And I did have one more question. Do you think we have time for one more, Dolores?
I do.
Okay. Just because I wanted to highlight that folks on this project team for the Pathways to Resilience project are in the process of identifying and mapping migration pathways in their region. And it's very much like a geospatial exercise. So I was curious if you had any thoughts about what we might want to consider that isn't perfectly captured when you're looking geospatially at migration pathways. You talked a lot about in-field research. So yeah. I'm just, wanted to try to see if you had any thoughts about the difference between, looking at migration on a map versus this field research.
Yeah, I think when it comes to geospatial, which is, you're totally correct, Mary, it is another tool in the toolbox you should definitely use when thinking about your sites or potential sites. I think if your state, whether state agency or NER, whoever it is, has conducted SLAM modeling or sea level rise modeling, I think that is an awesome tool to use to kind of understand, just to filter out a lot of sites where it might be a potential. I think you can also use Google Earth. I know I've kind of hit on these impairments a lot, but you can really finding a lot of these ditching or impairments, I think, are really easy to possibly find using Google Earth. If you're finding a big swath of red maple swamp that has some really nice weird straight lines, I think that's possible. I think it's a great use. If you're seeing a lot of pools on your marsh and that waffle pool dynamic, it's a good indication you might have some perimeter ditching as well. I would think those are probably the two biggest tools I can think of off the bat that might help you, that might pair really nicely with a site visit or just filtering down sites as well. And I know Rachel Stevens at Great Bay NER has done an awesome amount of work for that, preparing all of us in New Hampshire with making those big decisions.
Awesome. Great points. Thanks again, Grant. And I think we can wrap up, Dolores.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Grant. That was amazing deep dive. And I learned a ton today. And thank you all for making time today for this conversation and to learn with Grant. And if you could pull your calendars out and mark them for our next webinar, which is Making Way for Wetlands, a conversation about land acquisition in support of marsh migration. This one's going to be on August 21st from 2 to 3:30 Eastern time. And we are in the process of planning it now, so I don't have a registration link for you, but that will be coming soon. I can tell you though, it's going to be kind of a panel style format and a conversation, and it's going to be with some seasoned conservation veterans. We're going to be hearing from Mark Silberstein from California's Elkhorn Slough Foundation, which for those of you who don't know is the nonprofit partner to the Elkhorn Slough Reserve. The foundation was started in 1982, and it's been working with the reserve and many, many, many other partners in the central coast of California since then to conserve and restore Elkhorn Slough and its watershed, including, of course, its precious tidal marshes. We're also going to hear from Alex Wolf and Seth McKee from New York's Scenic Hudson. So this is a bi-coastal conversation. Scenic Hudson, for those of you who don't know, is a great friend of the Hudson River Reserve in New York and the largest and oldest conservation organization in the valley there, and it operates from New York City all the way up to Albany. They have been a longstanding partner in land acquisition for the reserve. So we should make sure to add those folks to our next invite, I think, for this conversation, Mary. And again, we'll send out the registration link as soon as we can, as soon as we have it, but just block that time on your calendars if this topic is of interest to you. Okay, anything else you'd like to add, Mary?
I don't think so. I think we're all set.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
Great discussion.